with for many years. We'll engage him. I want to try to impress upon this class that we're going to talk about 20 years of work in about 2 hours, give or take. I'm not in the real estate business to make a quick buck. It takes a lot of work and a long time, and I'm going to try to help you understand how I took investments and over a period of time was able to increase the value of those investments and then be able to trade the accumulated value in those properties into other properties and not pay the tax. Because when you have to pay Uncle Sam, you lose a lot of your equity that you otherwise was going to reinvest.
So let's welcome him. The floor is yours, Mr. Lehrman.
Thank you. Before I start, I thought I'd give you all a little bit of background about myself. I'm a native Washingtonian. I was born in 1949. I'm president of a company called Lehrco Corporation, and I specialize in grocery-anchored neighborhood retail. I find it's very valuable to try to find a particular aspect of real estate that appeals to you, because if you really like what you're doing and you're passionate about it, it won't seem like work, even though it is. But you'll find you'll have a lot more energy and a lot more inclination to put in the time. My family co-founded Giant Food in 1936, so I had a head start. I'm not going to apologize for that, but it was something that certainly gave me exposure to the grocery business, and it influenced my decision to focus on grocery-anchored neighborhood retail. My mother used to tell me that one thing people always have to do, no matter what the economy is, they have to eat. So the grocery stores are a business that's very solid, it's very stable, and it's very long-term. Okay, so I want to introduce my team tonight. Again, Steve Glazer, who's the managing partner of Glazer Winston. He's an attorney. And then Mark Roth, the managing partner of Buchanan and Company, and he's the accounting firm. So gentlemen, Steve, if you take a minute and just introduce yourself to the class and tell them a little bit about yourself, please.
I'm Steve Glazer. I'm not from Washington. I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio. And when I finished law school in 1976, I decided to move to Washington, but wanted to be involved in real estate. So I came here, and unlike most of the lawyers that I graduated with, who wanted to go into one of the government fields and work one of the agencies, I started working with a local D.C. real estate firm, and then stayed in the local community. I always envisioned I'd go back to Cleveland, but never doing that. I worked at a large local firm for about 18 years, and then in the early 90s I started my own law firm. And we specialized in commercial real estate and banking, primarily in this area, and do a lot of work in New York, South Florida, Texas, throughout the Southeast. We get involved occasionally in 1031 transactions, but they're usually, like in Sam's case, it's ancillary to other real estate work that we're doing. And that's part of trying to look globally at a transaction and decide, early in the transaction, decide how best to structure it, and whether you're going to structure it and include a transaction that is benefits from a tax deferral. But that's just part of what one does and what we do, and part of why I think it's important for anyone to have a good team at the beginning, as Sam has emphasized, to help structure a transaction, because it's much harder once you're already in a transaction to undo what's already been done. So, Mark?
I'm Mark Roth, and like Steve, I also am not a native of Washington. I moved here in 1982 and began my public accounting career with Buchanan and Company. I just accepted the job. I had no idea what I would be doing, but Buchanan and Company has a long-term history of dealing with real estate clients, and so I've been involved in real estate for almost 30 years now. Most of our clients are involved in they're owner-operators of either commercial, residential, real estate warehouses. We do not do a lot of work with developers or construction. Basically, our client base has sort of held up quite well through the more recent upheaval because they're more conservative, and they weren't speculating on trying to build spec buildings or speculating on, you know, markets or condominium markets, things like that. So my experience has been almost 30 years in real estate, but again, only owner-operated properties.
Thank you, Mark. Okay, concept. Concept is, how do you transfer creation of value without having to pay the tax? Keep what you've created and be able to reinvest it. Like-kind exchange. I'm going to give you an example of a property that I purchased in 1991, and I enhanced the value, and I'll discuss how I did that. And it took about 10 years to enhance the value, because there was a lot of work for me to get to know the neighborhood and what was going on and what the opportunities were, and then to then be able to take an income-producing piece of real estate, sell it, and reinvest the proceeds in another income-producing piece of real estate. So like-kind exchange. So that'll be the first example. Second example is going to be an equity transfer, and that's going to be a property where I was permitted to make an investment with a gentleman to become his partner, and he and I owned the property for about 10 years, and he decided that he wanted to sell the property because he had other uses for the equity or the value that had been created over the 10 years. And I'll get into some of the specifics of that, which I think you'll find interesting, because there's lots of different twists and turns to real estate and how things evolve, and there really isn't a straight line, and there really isn't a shortcut when you're dealing with tax-deferred transactions. Okay. Purchase of Woodmont Corner. Woodmont Corner is a property that was located in downtown Bethesda. It was a two-story retail building. When I purchased it, it had a bowling alley in it. It had a movie theater in it. It had an ice cream shop, and it had a merry-go-round. And the property itself was enclosed, so all of the retail was on the inside. And this was a prominent corner in downtown Bethesda, and everything was really not visible from the street. So in this day and age, when you walk down the street and you see retail, you can see it right from the street. I'll talk about the repositioning of the property, how I tried to enhance the value by virtue of getting it rezoned for a high-rise residential building. And then the sale of Woodmont Corner. What happened to the property after it was sold? It got redeveloped and turned into condominiums. And then ultimately, where the money from this property went, which is into a property called Bull Run Plaza, which is a grocery-anchored community center that's located in Manassas, Virginia. Okay, so again, as I said, here is Woodmont Corner, and this is Old Georgetown Road, and this is a street called Woodmont Avenue, so it's close to the corridor that goes out towards Rockville. And here was this property in downtown Bethesda, again, two-story building, and the site area was 56,837. The building size was 55,000. Now, why am I bringing up this distinction, this difference? There are so many facets to real estate, I can't encourage you enough to take the onion and peel the layers off. I found as I got into this creation of value that a neighbor in an apartment building had actually used some of the street to be included in the calculation of the footprint of the property. They were able to go out into the street and include some of the street frontage into their calculation. And once they did it, I decided if they could do it, and the governing bodies would permit them to do it, that I was going to make sure I did it too. So I ended up creating a little more value by taking some of the street that wasn't technically on my property, but the jurisdiction had permitted that to be done, and they had set a precedent. Okay. Here is what Woodmont Corner looked like after it was renovated. So again, I tried to explain to you that initially all of the retail was located on the inside. There was none of this street front, no awnings, no entrances out from the street. And I tried to do this in a way that I thought would catch people's eye. They'd know where the property was. They could see it driving by. I'm very big on aesthetics in real estate. I think the curb appeal of a property is extremely important. And I do more than most as far as maintaining my properties and try to make it a place where the consumer, the shopper, is going to want to come and feel good about spending their money. Here is the aerial view, and the red line shows the footprint of this piece of property. And here's a tall office building. Here's a tall apartment building. Here's another tall apartment building. So I said to myself, why is this two-story building sort of in the middle of all these bigger buildings? That just didn't seem right to me. And I decided to pursue an opportunity to see if it was possible to get my site rezoned, change the zoning from commercial use or retail of 2 stories to a high-rise apartment building which would have been 12 stories. And it took many, many years, and it took a lot of persuading, and it took a very good real estate zoning lawyer who was, shall we say, highly regarded by the downtown Bethesda municipalities. And over time, we were successful in being able to rezone the property, again, from 2-story commercial to 12-story residential. And initially, the rezoning was approved for 12-story building, 285,000 square feet. So we went from 55,000 to 285. A lot of value when you have more feet. And the building was going to include 253 rental apartments and 18,800 square feet of retail, which would go on the ground floor or the first floor of the building. And it was going to include 250 underground parking spaces. So I'm very pleased that that was able to happen. And I said, you know, making progress. So I've still got the 2-story retail building, but I now have the permission to build something bigger and more density and have more value. The world changes pretty quickly. The financial markets change pretty quickly. Doesn't seem like they do, but they do. And the condominium market heated up dramatically in, I want to say, 2002, 2003, 2004. And I felt like if there was an ability to create even more value by getting this property approved for 158 condominium units, the ultimate value would be greater than as a rental apartment at that particular time. Okay. Right now, the condominium market is challenging. People are not so quick to go buy a condominium. Right now, the rental market is about as hot as I think it's been in years. And people who are able to either create apartments or acquire apartments now have a very, very good opportunity to make a very nice return on their money. So timing is very, very important. Attempting to anticipate what's going on is very important. And the only way to really do that is to completely immerse yourself in the marketplace and what's going on. Because if you don't, you won't get a feel for what's going on, and you won't be able to make these decisions that are substantial in advance to time them with the opportunity that then will present itself. Okay. This is what ultimately got built on that site where there were 2 stories of retail. So there's retail on the first floor, and 158 condominium units above. Handsome building. I actually was involved with the design of this building because I didn't know I was going to actually be making this tax-free exchange. I actually had intended to originally build an apartment building, and you have to get the aesthetics approved by the local jurisdictions, what you're going to build, what it's going to look like, they want to know. And your reputation in real estate, like your reputation in life, is extremely important. Because if you demonstrate to people that you do what you do well, and you do it tastefully, they're going to probably be more receptive to considering what you want to propose in the future. So again, I can't overemphasize the importance of do what you do as well as you can do it. Try to do it in a way that suits your taste and your style. And in the long run, it pays off. It pays to do it thoughtfully and quality. Okay. The money that came out of Woodmont Corner that enabled someone else to create the apartment building allowed me to acquire a property called Bull Run Plaza. Now, this property is located in Prince William County in Manassas, Virginia. At the time I was able to acquire this property, the Manassas Marketplace was the fastest growing residential population in the Washington metropolitan area. This was back in 2005. So there were a lot of things about this property that were very, very appealing to me. Property had a strong mix of national, regional, and local retailers. Here is the property today. It's 414,000 square feet. So again, I started with that two-story building of 55,000 feet in downtown Bethesda. When I bought this property, one of the first things I try to do when I look at a property is I want to look at the curb appeal. What does the property look like? Has it been maintained? Is there anything that I can do to aesthetically enhance it to make it a more attractive place for people to come and spend money? These fountains were not there when the property was purchased. I made a substantial investment in the landscaping. It's not as evident by this slide, but I can tell you that there was a substantial amount of money put into the landscaping to, again, enhance the curb appeal and upgrade the attractiveness of the site. There's a Shoppers Food Warehouse in this property. And there is a roster of tenants that were very attractive to me. People go and spend money at these types of places. And when you have a property that has a roster of tenants that many people will come and spend money shopping, it just gives you more of an opportunity to create chemistry and synergy within the property itself. Now, one of the very important components of real estate is having the equity or the capital to make your transaction. The proceeds from the sale of Woodmont Corner did not provide me with enough equity to acquire this property. It's a large property, much larger than I had originally intended. It wasn't my model. Another very important point I want to make to you. Find what you like, find what you can do well, and stick with it. It's very important because you can't be an expert in everything. And if you find what you like and stick with your model and continue to do what you do, you'll get better and better and better at it. So, what do you do when you're looking for money? Yeah, you could go to a bank, but what many people do is they go to family and friends. You go to someone you know first, someone that hopefully you respect, you trust, that you like, that hopefully feels the same way about you. Just so happens that one of my family members, my brother, he's attending the class tonight, so if I say anything that isn't accurate, I'm sure he'll correct me. But my brother decided he was interested in investing with me in this property. So the ability for me to then put the capital structure together, the money, from the proceeds from Woodmont Corner, and my brother as my partner, enabled us to acquire this property that is located in Manassas, Virginia. Any questions so far?
Just have a question. You talked about the curb appeal. Do you think that this type of shopping center, which is mostly faced as inward on the parking lot, do you think that that is eventually the best thing is to have all of that face outward, face the street, face where pedestrians walk, like the Woodmont Corner?
All right, well, that's a very good question. I think it's important to consider the size of the property and where it's physically located. So if I can do this properly. So here is Route 234 in Manassas. This is Route 66. This is a fairly major artery that runs through Manassas. And the ability to really change much about that property would be extremely difficult and extraordinarily expensive. So in this particular case, I don't think that would be a viable alternative. And this property also has a LED reader board, and Prince William County doesn't permit them, but they made an exception years ago when this property was built, so it has one. Someone actually tried to take that approval away from me. They said it was distracting and they didn't want to be driving down Route 234 and see this reader board flashing advertisements. Very important part of this property. And when I tell you I had to fight to keep it and hire a lawyer and represent the fact that I was entitled to keep this, people will look to take away from you if they can. And whether it's malicious or otherwise, be prepared, and be prepared to stick up for yourselves, because if you don't, they will take it away from you. Let's see. Structure of the like-kind exchange. Legal requirements, financial requirements. I'm going to step aside. I'm going to ask Steve and Mark to spend a few minutes and get into the specifics of this transaction. You may actually have some questions of them, because having a team of qualified people that are available to you, that can help advise you, help guide you, because there's no second chance with the government. If you don't do it the way they want you to do it, they're going to come back and they're going to disqualify your transaction. So you really need to pick good, competent, experienced people that you can trust and rely upon to assist you. All right, I'm going to turn it over to the two of you gentlemen, and I'll sit down until you're done.
The dean has to excuse himself, but it's nice to have him here for a while.
In many respects, Woodmont Corner was a fairly straightforward transaction in terms of doing a tax-free exchange. And it is probably more unusual that you will find that than find something that's got a lot of complications. It was straightforward in the sense that we had, on the selling side, we had a single seller, and then on the buying side, we had a single buying entity. So when you're doing a tax-free exchange, primarily you're looking to take your equity and whatever the tax consequences would be and roll them into another property. In this instance, it would not have been that complicated, but yet still there are a lot of other issues that you have to deal with, that you're always going to have to deal with. There's simple rules, and you can look at the rules. You can go through Google and find out, and, fundamentally, the rules for a tax-free exchange are set forth in the Internal Revenue Code. And they list that you can identify a property, you sell a property, you identify a property, you trade one for the other, and we can go through all the different rules, but it isn't the only way that on a tax advantage basis you can sell one property and get another. And the next property, I point that out because the next example that Sam's going to go through is a property where we tried to do a like-kind exchange, and we didn't fall within the technical rules, but yet we were able to do a tax advantage transaction by doing what was called ultimately a liquidating distribution of interest in an entity, and it got very complicated, but you didn't have to go through a tax-free exchange. The nice thing about a tax-free exchange is that the Internal Revenue Code sets forth specific safe harbor requirements, and if you do them, then you can satisfy the provisions and not have to pay the tax. Here, we had a selling property. We entered into a contract to sell the property, and remember, the first thing we had to do is, the question was, when are you going to sell the property, particularly if you're redeveloping it for use as a condominium? Because when you sell the property, you want to be able to get capital gains treatment. So it's an interesting, well, it's kind of a side issue. If you're a developer of condominium units, you're not holding property for sale, or you begin holding property for sale in the ordinary course of business to your customers, so it becomes inventory. And when you sell it and you sell it for profit, then you would pay ordinary income. Here we had a situation, the question was, do you develop it and take it all the way through, create the condominium units and sell the condominium units? Well, that's the best from a gross sales price. You've got risk in getting from building the building and proceeding, but in terms of pure dollars, that's a great way to go. But you're taking all this appreciation from two-story building to fully entitled and taking all that appreciation and converting all of your appreciation to ordinary income. So there are ways that you can try to get around that, but I think it's important to keep that in mind whenever you're looking to do a transaction and what's the impact from a tax standpoint of what it is that you're going to do. So here the decision was made to sell the property and enter into a contract with the buyer to sell the property. And when you do that, you've got 45 days, the standard rule, you've got 45 days from the date that you finish the sale of your property to designate exchange properties. And then you've got 180 days from the original date. So first 45 days, and then after that, you've got 180 days, you have 135 more days to actually close on the property that you designate and be able to have a like-kind exchange. You can designate, there's a safe harbor, you can designate 3 properties, and they can have any dollar amount in terms of a purchase price. You can designate as many properties as you want, but they can't have more than 200% of the sales price of what you sold. Or there's a hybrid where you can designate, I believe it's like as many as you want, but you've got to close on 95% of them within the 180-day period, 95% of the purchase price, or you lose the whole thing. So there's 3 different requirements, and you can satisfy any one of them, and I think it's important to kind of get a sense of what you're looking to exchange into. But it makes sense to designate several different properties, because a lot of times you don't know what you're going to exchange into. You know that you want to sell on a tax-advantaged basis, but you don't know where you're going to put the money. The important thing is the rules set up this requirement that you never touch the money. And a lot of this is just a fiction, and this is statutory and falls on the heels of what once was an exchange requirement where you actually had to initially exchange something. You had to line up another property and another buyer who were willing to swap. And the idea was that as long as you weren't taking your money out, the underlying concept is if you weren't taking the cash off the table, if you weren't cashing in, you were only moving from one property to another, then you shouldn't have to pay the taxes. You should keep your money in productive use. So this fiction, statutory fiction, came into play, and it's somebody called a qualified intermediary. And I don't know what background you've had or how much you've learned of this stuff already, so if it's being repetitive, I apologize. Qualified intermediary is someone who cannot be related to any of the parties of the transaction. So it has to be someone that's not the buyer's attorney, not their accountant, not a family member. So there are these companies, then, often title companies, that have come up, and you'll pay them a modest fee, $1,500, $1,800, and they act as a qualified intermediary, and the purpose of a qualified intermediary is to hold the proceeds of the sale, because you can't ever touch it. As soon as you touch that money, you void the whole exchange. You'll have to pay taxes on whatever you've sold. So in this instance, we hired a company that was affiliated with the title company we did business with, and when the money was sold, when the property was sold, we took all the net sales proceeds, they stayed with the qualified intermediary. And you're stuck with it for 180 days. You can't get to the money. Even if you don't designate, you designate your properties in the first 45 days, you can't find, you don't acquire any of them, whatever it is, they've got the money for 180 days. You can invest the money or request how they're going to invest it. So there's certain prescribed investments, mostly just in banks, treasuries, that kind of thing. So here, during that 45-day period, Sam went out, looked for properties, identified properties, came up with this property. And one of the other requirements in your exchange property is you don't have to have anything of any particular size, but if you don't match up debt and you don't match up debt, purchase price, and use all of your money, to the extent that you don't, you've got boot, and you'll have to pay tax on that. So you have to be very careful to make sure that if you've got $5 million worth of debt, that you have at least $5 million worth of debt on the exchange property. If you've got $5 million worth of equity, you got to use all that equity. If you got a $10 million price, you got to buy something for $10 million. So it's got to have all these various components. To the extent that it doesn't, you'll pay tax. So in this instance, we found a property that was considerably more money than the one that was being sold, and more equity. So we're able to satisfy the debt requirement, we're able to satisfy the amount of the purchase price requirement, and then the question was the equity requirement. We're able to get the extra equity by being able to bring in an investor, but remember in this instance, the investor had to come into the same entity, because when you're selling, technically what you've got to do is whoever owned the property beforehand has to own the new property. And that's where a lot of times you run into problems and it becomes difficult because you want to bring in investors. Then how do you bring in an investor? You bring them into an old entity, and often you have old entities with liabilities. So an investor comes in and says, well, I don't want to put my money in because I don't know what liabilities this entity may have. And then you go out and you try to get a loan, and the lender says, I don't want to make a loan because this old entity may have had other problems. There may be potential lawsuits. You may have issues with old investors. And everybody wants a new entity. And plus, you'll find if you've studied finance that when lenders make loan now, they generally require SPE, well, they call SPE requirements, single purpose entity, and often bankruptcy remote requirements. And those are provisions in the organizational documents of your entities that will make it difficult for you as a property owner to file for bankruptcy. And it'll make it difficult within the bankruptcy to be able to prevent a lender from being able to foreclose and take their property. Because the lenders learned a lot in the early 90s when they get pulled into these massive bankruptcies that it became very difficult, that ultimately didn't get to the collateral that they thought they had. So here what we had to do is we had a new lender. Actually, we were assuming a loan in this transaction, and the lender wanted to find a brand new entity. Well, we had an old entity from the original property, and we had to use that entity, yet we were buying this property. Well, it's a great thing that if you have a single-purpose limited liability company, and that's become a lot easier because 15 years ago we weren't using limited liability companies. But if you have a single-member limited liability company, so it would be both single-purpose, just this one asset, and a single member, it's a disregarded entity for income tax purposes. So as far as the Internal Revenue Code concerns, it doesn't exist. So we're able to create a brand new entity to buy Bull Run and have as its sole member Woodmont Corner. So from a tax standpoint, the new entity is disregarded. The taxpayer remains Woodmont Corner. But from the lender's standpoint, they're making the loan to this brand new entity. We're able to put in all the single-purpose requirements, the bankruptcy remote requirements that the lender wanted. And we're able to satisfy that. The point is that you're never doing these things in a vacuum. So it's easy to look at rules and say, okay, I got 45 days, and I got to designate, and I got to trade. But you've got so many issues in dealing with financing and investors and things that you have to overlay. So what makes it an interesting and a challenging process is that every time, Sam was talking about peeling back the onion, you always throw in another complication. And that's what makes it kind of fun. Yes?
So the lenders will ignore the liabilities of the member or members of the new entity?
For the most part, well, it all depends on whether that's the manager or not.
Right. So
If you're in a position where you're a non-manager, and it also depends often on the loan size, because above certain sizes, usually around $25 million or so, and this would be larger, the requirements change, and those are often dictated by the rating companies. The rating agencies will make a determination of above loans of a certain amount, how they're going to view that, and who has what control. But here, what you would end up doing is you would drop down the equity. You would create subsidiaries, either one or two single-purpose entities. You could drop down whole layers. You could have one or two subs that you come in and drop the entity down. And you can have a manager or the controlling person be a non-member manager, so they don't have to have any equity interest. Or if you want to, you can have a small amount of equity interest, have a separate manager, and still not defeat your tax-free exchange. Because you're still going to have the taxpayer be this one entity. So sometimes what you may have to do is go up 2 levels to get where you want to do, to be able to create, to satisfy all the bankruptcy remote requirements and single-purpose requirements. But fundamentally, the basic rule is, right, 45 days to designate, 180 days to close, and you can't touch the money. You've got to give it to a qualified intermediary. That's what we did here. Then it gets fun. You can do things like reverse exchanges. And although this wasn't a reverse exchange, just keep that in mind that there are transactions where statutorily what you can do is you can buy your exchange property first and then sell your property later. Doesn't necessarily make any sense, but you can do that, and the same people who act as qualified intermediaries will act as in a different capacity, and they will become kind of a titular title holder to your property. But it gets a little complicated because what you're going to have to do is, let's say we wanted to buy this new property first, we'd have to go out, come up with all the equity first, close on the loan, create this new entity, and then you've got 180 days to sell the other one and swap it back. So you'll have a situation where this intermediary is the owner of the new shopping center that you just bought, but they're acting on your behalf. And then you sell the original property, and then they will then transfer that property that was bought first to the owner of the relinquished property. And there are rulings from most of the local jurisdictions that say that you don't have to pay double transfer taxes. There's an exemption because you've got this intermediary who's acting only in a fiduciary capacity, and they have express rulings in the district in Maryland where you get around it. Because remember, a lot of times you want to structure these transactions, but you're not only dealing with lenders, you're dealing with different jurisdictions, and you're trying to move property around, and when you do that, you've got transfer and recordation taxes. So it becomes really interesting. I think it's a really fun area in which to be involved because it's never easy. There's always something that you get added to it. But I think those are just basically the outline of tax-free exchange, at least as it was applied here. Mark?
Very good. Thank you, Steve.
I brought handouts for you. It's a PowerPoint presentation that we use in our firm for continuing professional education, and it's just sort of an outline of the steps that Steve was talking about, the 45-day rule, the 180-day rule. It goes into reverse exchanges. Also goes into talks about a number of other real estate transactions, and real estate transactions, different components. The gain is characterized differently, and it means a difference in the tax, so that's something that people are very interested in. We've had some clients who don't like to do like-kind exchange because the one thing that happens, if you have a zero depreciable basis in the property that you sold, that transfers to the new property. So if you have like a basis of let's say you have a basis of $1 million, you deferred a gain of $29 million. You sold the property for $30 million. You deferred $29 million worth of gain, and you go and you buy a $30 million property. Your depreciable base, or your basis in the property, replacement property, is $1 million. So you can't count on a lot of you can't count on depreciation or anything like that. Some people lose sight of the fact that you're deferring the gain, if you ultimately sell the replacement property, you're going to pick up that gain. I think there are three things that are really, really important. Usually we have people come in who are not very sophisticated, and they maybe owned a townhouse or something, and they sell it. And they say they didn't exchange, they didn't bother to talk to anybody or have any counsel or anything like that. And the common mistake that people do is, let's say they sold the townhouse for $100,000, and after they paid off the loan and the settlement costs, they walked away with $70,000. So what do? They go out and they reinvest $70,000. You can't reinvest your net proceeds, your net proceeds at closing. You have to reinvest, at least reinvest what the sales price was. So that's one important point. So you always have to reinvest what you sold the previous property for, or reinvest for more. Otherwise, you may have an element of gain. Yes?
Yep, your equity has to be what the value of the previous
Well,
property was.
the money goes into escrow, so you really can't. So let's say in our $70,000, you have to put the $70,000 in to the property. In my example, okay, you sell the property for $100,000. At settlement, you end up with $70,000. That's being held by the escrow agent or the qualified intermediary. The $70,000 has to go into the replacement property, and you have to come up with $30,000 more. Now, it can be debt, or you can put more money in, but the rule is you have to reinvest the $100,000, otherwise you have a taxable gain.
So the value of property being has to be equal
To be safe, it should always be more than what the value of the property you sold. The second thing that I've seen people try to do is they try to do a seller financed transaction where they sell the property and they take back a note. Well, that's fine. You can defer the gain on taking back the note. You defer the gain. You only report the gain as you collect the note. It doesn't work in a like-kind exchange, because what happens is that the basis transfers to the new property, but as you collect the note, it's 100% gain. So it's not like a wise thing to do to try to sort of like facilitate a transaction by taking a seller take-back note. I've never seen this. Possibly if you take back the note and the intermediary holds the note and the note is actually collected within the 180-day period, that might work and your exchange might still work. But basically, don't try to sell the property and take back a note. I think I have clients that would waited years because they have the property that they're ready to sell and they can't find the replacement, or they find the replacement property but they can't sell the one they have. Sam commented on this transaction as a very difficult transaction, and I have to say he was very lucky because the stars came into alignment very quickly, that by the time they had decided to sell Woodmont Corner, that within like a week, the opportunity to buy Bull Run Plaza presented itself, and that does not happen a lot. You have to do a lot of planning, and you have to really, it's a lot of work to try to line up what you're going to buy and what you're going to sell. As Steve said, there's a limit. You can't, we're going to sell the property. You can't like go down, well, we're just going to identify every property on K Street. Maybe one of them is going to be a sale. You have 3 properties of unlimited value, and then the next, if you have more than 3 properties, it can only be can't be more than twice the value of the property you gave up. And the last thing that I wanted to cover about reverse exchanges, the reason they came about was it's not something that people recommend. I've never seen anyone recommend it's a great idea. It came out as sort of a relief for someone who maybe set up the exchange. They identified the property, they had the sale lined up, they identified the properties, and when they go to closing, the sale of the old property falls through, and then they're stuck buying the new property. So the reverse exchange came out as sort of a relief provision for people that, we tried to sell the property, it fell through, so you're given another 180 days to try to do the exchange. I think reverse exchanges might be used in maybe somewhat in construction. Some people the replacement property, they try to build it. They try to build it during the 80-day period.
I used a reverse exchange recently in a very complicated transaction where there was going to be a foreclosure. And you're seeing it more now where people have substantial tax consequences, where you may have a very low basis, you've refinanced your property a bunch of times, you get $10 million worth of debt, and all of a sudden it's worth $5 million in today's economy. And what's happening is the bank, you're going to get foreclosed on, you give it back, and you don't have a lender who wants to work with you necessarily. And if you get foreclosed on, you've got a difference between your sales price, which is the amount of debt that that's been extinguished of $10 million. You may have a depreciable basis of just a couple $1 million. You have a real big tax liability. So sometimes, although being able to satisfy all the rules is difficult, but you may be in a situation where you have to do a reverse exchange because the timing of when the foreclosure is going to occur. In many jurisdictions, it takes 3, 4, 6 months or more to get the foreclosure ratified. So you may, in this instance, we had a client who bought a property and then just under the wire, and that was hard. We were able to have the foreclosure and then take all the gain and roll that into the property that was foreclosed on, or into the new property.
I just have one comment on foreclosures. I'm sure that almost any accounting firm who deals with real estate, and any law firm in the city deals with real estate, has done a like-kind exchange on a property that's been foreclosed upon. It's certainly not a transaction that anyone goes out and recommends this is a nifty idea to do. It's like you have no choice, and you're sort of taking your chances. And I'm sure that was the situation. Reverse exchanges and exchanges with foreclosures are not. You're adding another layer of complications. You're adding a number of different tax risks doing that. It's not something that anyone would ever recommend, but only as a last resort. I will leave the handouts, again, it's a number of slides, but it goes through all these rules. I think that you're writing papers or something on this, so there's code sections mentioned, but it's fairly step-by-step. This is how the exchange works.
Okay. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Mark. There's one other thing I'd like to point out to you to help you appreciate some of the nitty-gritty that goes into these kinds of transactions. And I can tell you I had a lot of sleepless nights, and I want to put this on the table because I want you to be aware of it. So let me do this properly. Okay. Woodmont Corner got redeveloped from a vanilla building where everything was on the inside to a more attractive retail building that everything opened up on the outside. I don't know if any of you are familiar with a tenant called Olson's Books and Records. They were a successful tenant a number of years ago. They did what they did very well. The Borders of the World and the other larger booksellers just made it very, very difficult for Olson's. But at the time this property was under my ownership, Olson's was a major tenant at this end. Ritz Camera ended up being a tenant on the corner. They liked the visibility. Very, very good tenant. And lo and behold, one day Outback Steakhouse came along and they decided they wanted to be in Woodmont Corner. It's unusual when tenants knock on your door and say, we want to be in your property. Most of the time you have to go find them, you have to persuade them, you have to incentivize them, you have to figure out how you're going to get them. So when Outback Steakhouse, and at the time I had not heard of Outback Steakhouse, Outback Steakhouse came and they said, we want to be in your property. And I was telling you about that ice cream store that was originally in it. So we decided to potentially put Outback into the location where the ice cream store was. Now what did I do? Because I didn't know anything about Outback Steakhouse. I said to the head of the leasing department of the company that was overseeing the property, I said, I want to go to an Outback Steakhouse. I want to go, I want to see it. I want to see what kind of food they serve. I want to go back into the kitchen. I want to know everything about Outback Steakhouse. Because if I'm going to make a decision to allow a tenant to come into my property, I want to make sure they're a viable tenant. So I'm a big football fan. I like Monday Night Football. But that's when I wanted to go to this restaurant, and they didn't take any reservations. So now I get there, and I got to wait an hour. I'm not very happy about that. But I wanted to make sure I knew what I was getting myself into. The head of the leasing department had called ahead and identified who we were so that when we were ultimately seated, and I didn't ask for any preferential treatment, we sat down, and when the waitress said, "What do you want?" I said, "I want one of everything on the menu." And I asked the waitress to prepare each dish the way I asked for it. I wanted to see what they would do. And I wanted to taste their food. I wanted to see if I thought it was good. Because if I liked it, I figured maybe other people will like it too. But if I didn't, then I didn't want them to be in my property. It's very important to pick the right tenant. It's easy to get them in. It's hard to get them out. And why am I telling you all this? Outback Steakhouse could have prevented this tax-free exchange from happening because the term of their lease extended past the time when I was intending to try to do this transaction. So they had a valid lease in place. They could have stayed there. Remember I told you about peeling that onion back and paying attention to all the things that are going on? Well, one of the things that sometimes a restaurant will do is they'll report sales. So you can get an idea, you can take their temperature as to how they're doing. I realized that Outback was not doing the kind of business at this location that they really thought they should have done. And so I knew that. I had that information in my back pocket. And Mark made a comment. He said I was lucky. And I think I was a little bit lucky. But when I was contemplating this transaction to trade this property with the value that was created from the rezoning into the new shopping center, I knew if I didn't find something, I wasn't going to be able to do this. And I worked with a broker in the retail component of the brokerage area, and he helped me become aware of the fact that that property, Bull Run, that I traded into, was going to be coming onto the market. So yes, I was lucky that I was able to do it, but the more you do your homework, the more you dig in, the more you pay attention to what's going on, the better chance you have of being able to do what it is you want to do. All right, I'm ready to move on to the next transaction. Again, I welcome any question from any of you. Is there any other questions about the Woodmont Corner Bull Run transaction? Okay. So let's see if I can continue to get this to work.
I've got a quick question.
James.
Okay.
You said it's good to focus on one particular niche. It seems like these two properties are substantially different with the apartment and then condominium.
Very good question, and I'll give you the answer, and you reminded me of some notes that I didn't communicate to you. Very good question. So, again, I told you my family co-founded Giant Food in 1936. And when my father passed away in 1974, my mother went on the board of Giant. And when my mother passed away in 1986, I went on the board of Giant. So I had a chance to represent my family as a board member. And I became very interested in grocery-anchored neighborhood retail. And our partner, their name was Cohen. When I was on the board, they said to me, "We don't want you to own any grocery-anchored neighborhood centers, because if you do, it could be considered a conflict because you have inside information. We don't want you as a board member to own one of our properties because that could be a conflict with stockholders. And we don't want you to own a Safeway anchored center or a Shoppers Food anchored center because we're concerned that we're absolutely holier than Caesar's wife, and we don't want any potential taint to occur as far as you're investing money." So Woodmont Corner didn't have a grocery store. But I liked retail. I wanted to get into it, and I found the opportunity. thank you for asking the question. It helped me communicate something that I didn't explain as clearly as I should have. All right, any other questions on Woodmont Corner? Okay, so now we're going to move to a different kind of a exchange. This is called an equity transfer. And why is it called an equity transfer? I was able to make an investment into this Penmar shopping center, and I'll go into that in a minute. Then we'll describe how the Penmar shopping center sale came about, how I needed to find a property to try to reinvest the money from the Penmar sale, and the Rock Creek purchase came about. And then I want to go into a little bit of detail about the kind of improvements that, again, I try to make whenever I acquire a property to make it more attractive to the consumer. Because I have a model now. I've done it before. And I think I'm getting better at it because the more you do anything, you hopefully improve. So here is the Penmar Shopping Center. Now, how did this even get on the radar screen? So I told you, I think, that we sold our interest in Giant in 1994. And so now I have access to some capital, because instead of owning Giant Food stock, I now have some money, got some cash, but I want to do something with it. So I decided that now I didn't have the conflict of not being able to buy a grocery-anchored neighborhood center because I'm not involved with Giant anymore. Although I did buy one share of stock back, and I kept it, and I never redeemed it, and it's going to stay in my office for the duration because it's part of my family and part of something that's very special to me. So I went out and I identified a retail broker who had a good reputation and who was willing to work with me exclusively. Now that's somewhat unusual. But I decided strategically, if I could get one person to really pay attention to me, who was good, that I might have a better chance of being able to identify what I was interested in buying, which was grocery-anchored neighborhood retail. So what did I do? I got a map, and I got a 50-mile radius of Washington, D.C., and looked at every single existing grocery-anchored neighborhood center within a 50-mile radius of Washington, D.C. And I went with this broker, and we went for 9 months looking at properties. And the gentleman that managed Woodmont Corner for me, his name is Gary Rappaport. I wanted him to come with me because he is very knowledgeable about retail, and specifically grocery-anchored retail. So the three of us rode around one day a week for 9 months and looked at everything that was in the marketplace. Now, why did I take so much time? Why did I do that? I was planning to invest millions of dollars that came to me from the sale of Giant Food, and I wanted to be responsible about it. And I needed to educate myself about the marketplace. What's out there? Where are the properties located? What do they look like? What are the communities? Is it a bedroom community of younger people? Is it more established? I wanted to get as much information as I could about what the product type was, where it was located. And in conjunction with a decision that was made for me to buy my first grocery-anchored neighborhood property, after 9 months of driving around, the broker pulled off the side of the road, and he was tired. He didn't want to show me any more properties. He said, "What, anything else for us to look at?" And he said to me, he said, "What do you like?" And I looked at a lot of properties, and I thought about it. And I said, "Remember that property that we saw the very first day 9 months ago?" And he said, "Yes." I said, "That's what I like, and that's what I'm interested in." And he said to me, "It's not for sale." And I said to him, "You're the broker. You exclusively represent me. I'm going to pay you. Let's find a way to go buy that property." And we did. And that was the first grocery-anchored neighborhood center that I ever bought. And it is one of my best. And the reason I'm telling you this, when we drove around for the 9 months to look at everything, this man, Gary Rappaport, who's a very seasoned professional, he saw this property. So he's sitting in the car. Now this wasn't necessarily my prototype property. First of all, it was built in 1959. It's very vintage. But he could see that there was the possibility to take something that was old and make it newer. So he attracted a financial partner called ING. You all may have heard of it, large financial company. They decided to become his partner. And they invested with him, and he was able to renovate the property. Pretty sizable property, 387,000 square feet. Had good roster of tenants, Petco, Marshalls, Staples, has a Shoppers Food Warehouse. It was in Prince George's County, not a county where people were necessarily looking to invest money. But by virtue of us driving around and looking at all the properties, an older property that hadn't really been repositioned, and Gary knew that there was an opportunity for him to reposition it. Okay, so in terms of where it is, here's the Beltway. Here's Pennsylvania Avenue. We go in from the Beltway up Pennsylvania Avenue, and Penmar is just about a mile and a half from the Beltway. Good location, very good demographics, lots of customers, a property that really didn't have maybe the tender loving care that we try to bring to property.